So we're almost there. We're moving through and we only have one last game feature to add before we can move on to aesthetics, which is putting in tilts. Now for anyone that's unaware of how pinball works, you're allowed to shake the table a couple of times before it basically stops you from doing so, and the game's over and the flippers no longer work. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add in a tilt feature, which is going to be reasonably straightforward. And the first part, of course, is going to be going into our project settings, and I'm going to go to my input, action mapping, and I'm going to add left and right tilt. So we've got left tilt, right tilt, and I'm just going to bind these to my left and right arrows. So now we've put in left tilt and right tilt. I'm now going to go back to here, and I'm going to open up my player controller. Initially, let's set up the functionality for doing a tilt, and then let's go back and work out how we want it to affect the game. So initially, we just want to do the tilt left and tilt right. So I'm going to add the events. Now, to begin with, all I'm going to do is rather simple. I'm going to, when you press tilt, I'm going to get all actors of class, and I'm just going to get any balls that are currently in the map. So I've got the ball, at which point I'm going to check if this array is greater than 0. So I'm going to get the length of it, and I'm just going to make sure that there is at least one ball on the map. And if there's more than one, all I'm going to do here is, and again this is just kind of allowing for multi-balls in the future, I'm just going to say for each of the balls that are in there, let's add an impulse to it, to the ball. So we're going to project the ball in one direction or another. And just purely out of just an initial test value, I'm going to set this number to be -500. Now, the last thing that we will do is actually add a camera shake, but for the time being, I'm kind of okay with this. So if we wanted to as well, I could get all of this and I could collapse it into a tilt direction. And if I wanted to, I could collapse this into a singular function that left tilt and right tilt call. To do that, all I'd have to do is select all of them, right click, and I would now hit collapse to function, which is now going to be called tilt. So we've now got a tilt function, but there's one other thing I'd like to do here, which is, if this is a function, we probably want to change the impulse such that it works depending on whether it's left or right. Now I'm kind of going to just hijack one of the enums we already have here. So, because if you remember before, we had an enum that we created which was used for the flippers. Now the enum that we used for the flippers, if I open them up, was used for determining whether it was a left flipper or a right flipper. So we had flip type as an enum. So what I'm actually going to do is I might actually just hijack that enum since it is left or right, and since I know we're going to be pushing it left or right, I'm just going to make that a little bit more straightforward. So I'm going to go add a new variable to this function that we created, which is going to be called flip type, and it's just going to be called tilt direction. And the reason that I'm doing this is that this impulse we want to select depending on the direction that we're going in. So if it's left, we want to go -500, and if it's right, we want to go 500 on the X. So rather simple. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to check velocity change here, so it doesn't care about the weight of the ball, it just kind of pushes it regardless. And of course I'm going to add a reroute node here to just clean this up a bit. Compile, save, and if I look at my event graph, I'm now able to duplicate this. You can see that the variable is exposed, so I'm going to go left is now right. So we now have left and right tilt, compile, save. Now, I'm going to play, and if I hit left and right now, you can see that when I hit left, the ball's going up in that direction. So that works reasonably well. It's not great, but it'll, part of the reason it's kind of weird at the moment is, so if I just mash the button right now, it's going to fly up in that direction because we're adding an impulse. So we don't want to be able to do that. We want to have a minimum time between tilts, and we also really want to kind of have a maximum number of tilts that you can do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand this function, which at the moment is just assuming that you can tilt. So I'm going to go to tilt, and before I even do any of these get actors of class type of stuff, I think it's probably a good idea for me to check with the game type to see how many tilts have been done and whether I'm still allowed to tilt. So I'm going to open up my game mode. I'm going to add some extra work into there. So we now have a new variable, which is going to be called tilt count. And it's going to be an integer because we're just counting in whole numbers. And the default value for it is going to be 3 because we're going to allow ourselves to do 3 tilts. And one thing I'm going to do before I forget is when we reset the game, I'm going to make sure that one of the variables that we reset is going to be the number of tilts that we can do, which is reset game. It's function just over here. So I'm going to make sure that when we reset everything, I'm going to compile, I'm going to make sure that I set the tilt count back to being a value of 3. So I'll plug this into here, and you'll notice that when I've done this, this hasn't actually updated. This is one of those things that if you duplicate the node, it'll correctly reaccess it. And I believe if I was to relaunch Unreal, it would have been fine, but for some strange reason, it doesn't always load the values straight out. So I've just duplicated that, and tilt count is now back, so that when it resets it to default. So compile save. All I'm going to do now is just have since we're storing this in here, I'm going to go into my player controller, and I'm going to get the game mode. First off, I'm going to cast it to a pinball game, and this should always return true, so I'm just going to convert it to a pure cast. But all I'm going to do here is I'm going to check the tilt count, and if it's greater than 0, so if the tilt count is greater than 0, run through the function. There we go. If it's not greater than 0, then I don't really care too much. So we don't want to actually run it. So we're going through there. Now, one thing that I can do is that if that's false, if I wanted to, I could theoretically put in something in the game mode to disable the flippers as well, which is what a lot of pinball machines do when you go over the most amount of tilts. So all of a sudden the flippers would freeze up until the game has begun again. It's up to us whether we want to do that. To do so would require just adding a boolean to the game mode that we check against before we call flip in the flippers. It's up to us, but for the time being I'm going to just basically check the number of tilts that we've got, and if it's still above the threshold, we'll allow it. Now, after I've gone through all of this and I've completed this, the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get this game mode again. Decrement, minus minus. So we're just removing a tilt. There we go. Compile save. So now that that's set up, we should be only able to do 3 tilts. And I'll check that now. 1, 2, 3. And now my tilt's no longer working. Cool, fantastic. So we now have a functional tilt, although it's not entirely how I want it to be, which is to say it's currently missing a camera shake. So at the moment when I tilt the screen, I really want to get the whole world kind of tilting with me to make it look like everything looks like it's been shoved in that direction. So what I'm going to do here is rather straightforward. Once I call this function to add the impulse, the other thing that I'm going to do here is call a function called client play camera shake. Now, a client play camera shake looks for a shake class, which is what we can set up as a basic set of variables for what a camera shake is. So I'm going to have to go back to here, and I'm going to create myself a new camera shake. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to create a new blueprint, and if I tap on the word shake, you'll see that camera shake is available under all classes. So I'm just going to select that, and I'm going to call this tilt shake. Now, when it comes to the variables for the tilt shake, the first time I double click on it, it's going to give me this, which is the standard blueprint layout. And it's got all of the graphs and everything else. A nice thing you can do is if you were to close that and then double click on it again, it would become just the default properties, which is really all we want. So it's a little bit cleaner to look at it this way. So I'm going to open this up, and I'm just going to quickly set up some settings. First off, we want the oscillation to last for 0.25 seconds. Next up, we want to set up the y-axis oscillation, which is sideways for us, and I'm going to set that to 500. So that's 500 units in that direction, and a frequency of 1 means that we go there and back, so it's a full sine wave of there and back. So now that we've got that, I'm also going to set the offset as being 0 rather than random, because we want this to be the same kind of tilt every time. I'm now going to compile and save, and that should be all that we actually need to get this initial tilt working. So in my player controller, I'm going to set this to be tilt shake. And the other thing that I'm going to do is, see we have play space? When I go to the play space, I can actually set it to camera local, which means we move in the y-axis, world, which means we move the camera along the world axis, so 500 along the world y rather than the camera y. But then there's also user defined. Now user defined is a very useful one for us to use in this situation, because if I wanted to, I could actually go ahead and set it up so that we can use the same shake to tilt both left and right, because tilting to the left is the same as tilting to the right, but just rotated 180 degrees for the play space. So to do that, what I can actually do is I can actually set this up to have a select on it, just like before. So I'm going to use this node again that we had. And all I'm going to say is if it's the left, then let's go ahead and get the camera. So get the player camera manager. There's a nice little function called get camera rotation. So if it's the left, we want to use that. And if it's the right, we want to rotate this camera by 180 degrees, which I can do so by combining rotators. So if you imagine the first one is just getting the rotation and the second one is rotating at 180 degrees on the yaw, which is the z-axis. We've now got ourselves a function that should move the camera left and right accordingly. So I'm going to save, hit play, and now when I fire the ball and I hit shake, you can see that we've now actually got the tilt happening until I can no longer tilt anymore. Everything else is good. So from that, we've now got the last of the actual gameplay features we wanted. I would strongly recommend trying out some stuff, like putting some blocking in there, so that when you hit the max tilt, we go ahead and we stop it from tilting anymore. Easiest way to do that is to use this this false node to set up a boolean that connects to a branch, but I want that to be something that participants work out on their own. So moving on to aesthetics.